The book that Stuart and I wrote, I mean, one of the titles could have been, The World That We Have Lost. And in conversations that we've been having this morning, I'm realizing just how much the organization of existing Christianity looms over the conversation, over the text that we have written. And even one of the key terms I think that we used in the book, because one of the terms that we used to explain why this model started changing and why people started switching to being able to self-identify as having no religion, is the notion of individual autonomy. And we basically are picking up on Colin Brown's notion there. He uses it in a very specific way, which is people's ability in the 1960s to be able to choose the ways that they express themselves sexually and the way that they identify themselves sexually, their sexual identities. I think there's much more to the term than that. And one of the things I'd like to do going forward is try to unpack what that term means. Because I think actually it's been around in terms of how people understand themselves quite a bit longer than the 1960s. I mean, when I was researching on Irish Catholicism in North America, I came across this article. It was called Nationalism as Pastime. And what the article is trying to get at is that, people always look at the speeches that people would have read in the newspapers about, Irish identity and the need for Irish independence, and that's why they were signing up to join an Irish nationalist organization. But the point of the author was that people sometimes joined a nationalist organization simply because they could meet up with people and have a good time. And feel good about it, right? Because this is all for a noble cause. So I think the thing is that people can forge identities that they come to own for themselves in various ways. And as you mentioned, Dia, they do this in association, right? I mean, identities get made in a variety of different ways, but not just someone sitting in their home watching TV, or in the solitude of, on a beach looking at a tide going in and out. They do it often one way or another in association with other people, whether it's through social media, whether it's a group of friends that they have, whether it's actually a voluntary organization that they join. But that's, I think, going forward, one of the things I want to do is sort of unpack how that happens and look at the kinds of different ways, both historically and hopefully into the present, and taking a little peek into the future, what this actually looks like.
Okay. Do you want to say anything more about your own work in terms of understanding non-religion?
Well, they're making very modest claims. Really what we were trying to do is just try to map how big does this look like. And, in other words, what is the scale of this? And I think you make a distinction between people who are non-church, in other words, people who basically have never been in church and never been exposed to its beliefs and practices, and those who, one form or another, are de-churched, right? I mean, either they or their parents went to church, and now they basically no longer go. They may still self-identify, when the census asks them, what's your religion? They might say Anglican, but they're not showing up in the Anglican rolls, membership rolls. They're typically probably not attending, certainly not regularly. They might go for family reasons, Christmas, for example. So I think you'll end up having a spectrum there in terms of what's happening. Those who are de-churched think they have an idea of what they walked away from. Non-churched, I think, the issue there is that they don't really understand what churches are on about. You know, churches can say things, but they don't really know what that signifies, because the language, the culture is something they're not familiar with. So if they have spiritual issues, my hunch is that they're not going to be looking to a church or local congregation to address those issues. So they don't really think, they don't understand what's being said, and what little they hear, I don't think they feel that their spiritual needs would be addressed. There's not going to be a connection there. Among the de-churched, I think the reason for not looking to the churches for spiritual needs is because they think they know what the church represents or what churches represent, and they're not going to find what they're looking for there. They're going to look somewhere else. So that's basically, I think, the way our take on what the religious landscape looks like at the moment. One of the things that astounds me is just how quickly, however you want to look at it, those who are disengaged from organized Christianity, just how big the number is. You know, we estimate that it's like 17.9 million Canadians, and it keeps growing. I mean, it keeps growing at really strong rates. I mean, it's significantly above the average growth rate for the country. You know, the country grew in the past decade, 2001, 2011, by 10%. This is growing quicker than that, right? So it's a growing trend. So if you're looking at people who can trace their background some way or another back to a Christian one, the real story here, I think, is that not only are people disengaging, or, you know, some might have a tenuous relationship with Christianity, walking away, but there's a growing number of people, we're probably now in the second generation at least, who have absolutely no exposure to organized Christianity, or any other religion for that matter. I think what that means for the future is that, what this, I think, tells us is that when people have existential issues, they're not looking to organized Christianity for answers.
I was trying to think about throughout the whole thing we just saw and all that. If young people in Mexico or worldwide trying to connect and seek for identity elsewhere than church, because we millennials, I really don't like that concept, because I think it diminishes the diversity of people that represents young people nowadays, right? But well, I was trying to think that this seek of identity, they trying to find it within the human rights scope, and they try to identify themselves like for social justice and activists in human rights, so they can have a collective identity and a community of social activists. So I think they have created this identity that church don't provide in the human rights framework. Yeah, and that's it, I think.
What about the role of the church in the lives of young people in Mexico? Have they been socialized into the church? Are they familiar with it? What is the attitude?
I think they are really familiarized with it, because we have a presence of religion really within the structure of family and traditions in Mexico. However, I feel that these principles of the religion, Catholic religion, does not represent them as well as they could have in other time, and they try to just look elsewhere. Yeah, and they try to do it with the tools they had given to them, and I think like secular education we have in Mexico, they try to guide us inside the human rights perspective, and that equality and democracy and I don't know, secularism is the principles that should guide our society. Yeah. Well, I think that church represents like this conservative scope that they don't feel identified with, because these conservative like principles, they don't really like them. Yeah, I think we are like really conscious about privilege and equality and feminism and all that. So, well, this is my bias. I don't know if it is like in whole Mexico, but in Mexico City, I think it's that way. Yeah. Well, I think within Mexico's context, young people are going to use this framework of human rights to empower themselves and do some changes, and like be attached to some other principles other than the church and other than the religion. Yeah.
So, I've been studying now for several years religion and education in Canada, and sometimes more specifically religion and education in Quebec. And it's 2018, so it's a 10-year anniversary that Quebec instigated or initiated its ethics and religious culture program, which marked a really definitive shift between schools as partners in with families in inculcating confessional religious beliefs in school, to the Quebec government acknowledging that though that partnership was ended, and that the diversity of religious beliefs and ways of being and understanding in Quebec had become significantly more diverse over time, that the new ethics and religious culture program would be a way to educate about religion, so not in a confessional way. And so 2010 that happened, and now 2008, so we're 10 years out. And curiously now there's been, just in the last month, a survey sent out to all the teachers across the province about whether they think that the program still is valuable, should it be taught in its current state, should it be changed, should it be amended, should it be done away with. And one of the things that comes out in that survey is the question of non-religion. And if we combine that with some of the sociological data about a quarter of Canada's population fitting into this religious nuns, non-religion category, then teachers could be teaching in a classroom about religious diversity to potentially a quarter of their students in a classroom having no religious memory or no religious affiliation, or having been raised with a different, altogether non-religious worldview. And so does teaching about religion then make being religious sort of a norm in a classroom? So I'm interested in what will come out of this survey, and in particular around whether beliefs such as belief systems that are not religious, so atheism, perhaps we could go down a list of ways that we categorize that, but how are they being presented in these programs? A great part of my research, I think, has been to learn from the countries that have had this conversation several decades ago, And so looking, for example, at the United Kingdom, where RE, as they call it, religious education, has been through many iterations, and they have had a recent legal case which went before the courts, Fox. I cannot say the year of the Fox case, but it was an atheist parents who were concerned that their child's RE class was diminishing somehow their worldview, their way of seeing things, and they actually won their case that atheism was then to be presented in the RE program on equal, on par with the other belief systems that were being taught.
Do you think education about religion is necessary?
I don't know. I think it's important to understand your neighbor. I think it's important to have a background in beliefs and ways of being and ways of living your day-to-day life that are perhaps you're not familiar with. And so that is kind of at the foundation of many what we call religious literacy programs. And though, of course, now looking towards the future, we need to broaden that to perhaps worldview literacy or some other way that we're going to be inclusive of all different ways of seeing and living and being in the world.
For me, this workshop is just an opportunity to come together with a group of people who are thinking about some of the same issues I'm thinking about in my research, but from different angles. So each person in this room has contributed to the way that I'm thinking about non-religion, about religion, about what I've described as the new diversity. So I'm thinking about the new diversity as the decline in institutional religion, particularly Christianity in Canada, because Christianity has been majoritarian religion, has had a great deal of influence. And so I'm interested in the ways in which the participation in Christianity is perhaps then meaning shifts in the social landscape. And I'm also interested in the tension around that, between that and things like the prayer case. So the Saguenay case out of Quebec, where an atheist challenges the presence of prayer in municipal councils, and turns out people all across Canada are saying prayer at the beginning of the municipal council meetings, not just in Quebec, as people like to imagine. And there's a great hue and cry about that. And that people describe this primarily not in religious terms, but in terms of culture and heritage. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the increased numbers of people who are self-describing as non-religious and what that means. And there I'm interested in muddy identities or blurry identities. And I think there's a great pull to revert back to understanding non-religion as meaning simply atheism. And I don't think it is only atheism. I think there's a continuum. And we need to think about that more carefully. And we need to be especially careful, as Dia mentioned earlier, not to simply frame non-religion in terms of not being Christian. That there are other dimensions to this, and these are, to me, especially interesting. I'm interested in the increase of religions other than Christianity, and so religions that come with migration, which has been present in Canada for a long time, but how is that changing our landscape? And that can only be considered, I think, in relation to these other phenomena, like the decline of institutional Christianity, like the increase of number of people who self-describe as non-religious. And then finally for us in Canada, and there are other places as well, the increased presence or visibility or attention to Indigenous spirituality, which is the fourth piece of the new diversity. I'm I'm also interested in the ways that we imagine ourselves to perhaps be non-religious, but others as religious. And here I think specifically about the Syrian refugees and how they seem to be in public discourse imagined only as either Orthodox Christian or as Muslim, and Muslim in a very particular practicing, observant way, rather than the possibility that, for example, they are simply non-religious or culturally Muslim or some other variation. And so the ways in which non-religion is actually excluded from the public imagination as well as policy practices. So for example, you'll remember that we saw a lot of newspaper coverage about towns who couldn't receive refugees because they didn't have a mosque, as though mosque were the deciding factor in terms of an ability of a community to host particular family groups. So I'm interested in the ways in which all of these things tangle together. And I am interested in the social implications of non-religion more broadly. What does it mean when you have a society that has had social practices that look a particular way, and now that shifts? What does that mean for things like, and Brian has raised this in their work, what does that mean for volunteering, for charitable giving? How does that translate? Should we be worried? If there are real worries, how do we compensate for those worries? So a kind of scholarship in action as well as theoretical. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I guess last but not least is the diversity picture and world repairing work, which is work in which people engage together to address some of the pressing social issues of our time, pressing issues of our time, especially the environment. So how are people working together, moving past identities or differences caused by specific identities to work together in ways that repair some of the things that we might see as broken in the world. So those are my thoughts in terms of your work and putting it together with my work and some of the conversation we've had around these film bits. I actually think it's a really exciting time, and actually again inspired by Brian and Stewart's work. I thought at the beginning of their book when they said, this is a paraphrase, I don't think it's a direct quote, but we don't lament the decline or the lack or loss of privilege of Christianity. And I thought that was a really bold statement, particularly given how they self-identify in the book. But what that means is the landscape is changing, but I think it's a really exciting time because I think with perhaps one group not dominating the landscape, that opens a greater potential for equality in a very, if I can say, deep way, to start to equalize social relations, moving not only between humans but non-humans and the environment.
The questions that we're asking about religion and non-religion are time and context specific. They cannot be generalized. Therefore, a first move in being able to understand and therefore research this phenomenon is to start precisely at where is religion here? And we've already had a discussion of that in some senses. Religion here means Christianity. But then that has been expanded. Well, it means more than that. But if we start with Christianity, then everything that's not Christianity is non-religion. We then expand to religion, say now we're going to include Judaism, pardon the expression, Islam, and other of the R5, Hinduism and Buddhism. Then that becomes religion, and everything outside then takes on the hue of non-religion. Add more world religions and the box gets larger. But you see what I'm saying is that it matters how you construct the religion box. From there, then the non-religion, as Laurie was saying, can become a variety of things, but they're all those things that don't fit into the box. Then the question becomes, irrespective of how you construct the religion box, and let us, just for argument's sake, it's the world religions box. Because That's the default position that most of these discussions take. When we say religion, we mean that series of religions and the people who adhere, practice, believe. If that's religion, then the variety of things that are not religion becomes a little bit better defined, but still very, very fluid and very, very diverse. So in my research, what I've started with this, and then the task is, how do we go about finding these things without pretending that we already know what they are? And therefore, technique that I and my little group, to which several of you have belonged and do belong at various stages, have done is by saying, well, let's do it in terms of subjective responses of individuals, the usual kind of research techniques, but asking people. And ask them to locate themselves inside the concepts first. In the case of the work that I've been involved in, we do that with 2 words only, although there's a third one that creeps in, and that is religious and spiritual. But the one that creeps in, as you can understand from what we talk about, is also culture. So the first thing, you ask people to locate themselves within those concepts. Are you anywhere in this? Are you cultural? Does that make any sense to you, right? And then you get an answer. You get an answer along a scale. And then you say, okay, now we've got this artificial set of scales, and people locate themselves. Let's ask these people a bunch of questions and see if we can find any patterns in how they answer. And it will not surprise you that on the first iteration of this attempt, we found that the people who say they're religious almost always do it in the standard way. I'm a Christian, I believe in God and Jesus Christ, I go to church, I read my Bible, etc. I'm a Muslim, I believe in the Prophet Muhammad and Allah, and I pray 5 times a day, etc. And nothing else is in there. They don't do anything else that they consider to be important. Then when you get to people who say, well, I'm actually not that religious, right? And then the answers start going fluid. And the answers also become sparse. I'm not all that religious and I don't do much about it. Then you get to people who says, nah, I don't find myself in these concepts at all. And that's the stage that the research is right at, because then we have to do, what questions are you going to ask those people? And there's another subgroup that gets identified. So in the process of the research, you discover stuff. That's the fun about research. You get to find stuff you didn't expect. There's the people who have trouble with the concepts. We all know them. Many of them are in religious studies programs. I said, yeah, I could answer this question, but I have a lot of trouble with this. So we take these people out now and says, so what's your problem? And then we feed them back into a set of questions and to see if there's a correlation between people who have problems and the way they do whatever it is that they do. The idea being, in a kind of the old, the rounded theory sort of sense, is that then you hope that along the way, the data will speak to us. Say, well, what kinds of concepts are people using to put themselves into whatever worldview they have? Worldview being a kind of a placeholder. We need a word for it, so that's what we use. And see what comes out of that. And a whole variety of things will come out. Sometimes surprising ones. People who are neo-pagan, it seems, Wicca, Asatru, all those words, right? Consider themselves to be religious and seem to, in spite of their protestations, follow what one could call an orthodoxy and an orthopraxy. They do the same stuff. They believe many of the same things. So do people who practice indigenous spirituality. It's amazing how convergent what counts as indigenous spirituality is. So it looks like that works like a religion. Whether it did always is not another question. And then you have our famous, infamous SBNR, the spiritual but not religious, or alternatively, spiritually more than religious. They seem to have a kind of a very particular kind of profile. But most of their profile is they don't do much. It's an orientation, it seems. So these are preliminary findings, but all of it says is that when you approach it this way, you do find surprising precipitations out of the data of things that, at least in the team I've been involved in that's been done this, are sometimes really quite surprising, and other things are totally unsurprising. So that, for instance, on the surprising side, people who are sort of religious, but not much, we call them the religious threes. They answer for 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. That's the group that you find the most people in who identify with more than one of the standard religions. It's also the group that you find the most people in who do nothing except have an identity. Now this doesn't, the net result is you're not going to have definitive answers, but at least it's a possible way of almost like, you know, partridges in the bushes, you know, sort of flush and seeing what kind of things people actually do. Then we can map that onto other research approaches, such as people who research particular non-religious groups, and see how that maps onto what people at large are doing. Or take the big thinkers, you know, the Charles Taylors of this world, right? And see to which their philosophizing maps onto what people in a particular culture, in a particular place, are actually doing. And what I'd really like to do is do this kind of research in a really different place around the world, like China, where none of this works the way it works here. And anything that you want to add. Now, the question always is asked, what about the future?
Well done.
We are always living in times of transformation. And I consider myself to be a social scientist. And the last thing you want to do as a social scientist is prognosticate. Because the only thing you're going to get out of it is you're going to be wrong. I have the faintest idea what's going to happen in the future.
Chicken answer.
I can tell you what I'm worried about, but I have no idea
Tell
what
us what
that's.
you're worried about.
I'm mostly concerned in terms of repairing the world, since this is one of the things that that there are much stronger movements to not repairing it very deliberately. Like many people, I fear for the adult life of my grandchild. It's not going to be me, I'll be dead. It's going to be 2 generations down the road. But maybe we'll pull the iron out of the fire. The optimistic side. And does that have anything to do with religion? No, nothing particular. Because the other thing about there's an assumption that goes through a lot of the discourse, and that is that religion is somehow foundational and necessary, and that without it there's a problem. I don't see any real evidence for that. Not that religion is bad. It can do some, it has in the past, and can do a lot of really, really important work for world repairing and world building. But it doesn't seem to be the only way to do it.
So my work is, I've been very interested in how identity has been framed through the legal context and legal claims more specifically, and how religious identity has come out with positive and negative results, I'd say, over the years. I've been interested particularly in the Canadian context, but also how this has been replayed elsewhere in other contexts with similar constitutional frameworks, and then employing things that may not fit so well in their own. And I became a bit frustrated with the legal context and the way that things were defined, how you would define religious beliefs, how it has to be a sincere belief, and that is the end of the discussion we have. And I'm sure most of the social scientists around the table will say that that's where we start the conversation, not where we finish it. So for me, that was sort of a first point that is of concern. So I decided in my doctoral work to start looking at the administrative structure. So before it goes into the courts and gets a whole different set of legal language attached to it, what does it look like on the ground? Do we have the same kinds of conversations? Do we have more attempts at repairing damages? And sometimes we do. And sometimes we still go to court despite this. And that was notably the case in Multani, which was the 2006 Supreme Court decision about the Kirpan, where there were internal decisions that were made that everybody was happy with, and it still afterwards proceeded. And so there's a question here, even though we have something that could repair the initial situation, it still gets exacerbated by the legal structures around it. And I think that many of the recent court cases have sort of pointed in that direction. The inability to deal with indigenous spiritualities in a way that makes sense in the legal framework, which really could have been seen as a world-repairing approach or an approach of reconciliation that was sorely missed. And more recent discussions about this, notably the decision last week with Trinity Western about how do we balance questions of equality with religious freedom and harm in these kinds of conversations. So I've been very interested and preoccupied with the language that we use, the narratives, the discourse, the actual words, and how they come out and how they come back out, or not, in this context. And the work I've done more recently at more administrative levels, so more back to the ground, like within the school boards, I went into a municipality working with Lori on this to look at a Muslim cemetery project and what that looks like on the ground and what kinds of claims can be raised in favor or against it. And there were some very strong points that are brought up against, but if you look at the media analysis, there were also some really interesting pairings of local people from rural municipalities pairing up with the Muslim community and actually doing, door-to-door work on what this would actually mean on the ground and what would this actually look like. And these could have just been seen as feel-good stories, but I think that there is really an attempt at having a much more foundational discussion, but that only reached a few people. And it's a kind of a missed opportunity a bit in that way, which I found a bit disappointing. Part of our work also in this question of do we belong here, do we not belong here, where does the identity piece fit in, we'll use it again, came back to a film that we had seen separately, but that really spoke to this. So Nadine back in 2011 had a film called Where Do We Go Now? And it was about a small village in Lebanon that basically had an internal, that had been okay, and then the external pressures basically became internal pressures between the Christian community and the Muslim community. And the only way that the women who are not involved in this could deal with it was that they basically exchanged identities. The Muslims became Christians and the Christians became Muslims. And the closing scene is them coming to the cemetery and not knowing where to put their dead. And so this comes back a bit to the work that we've done. Are we localized in these contexts? Are we actually trying to engage in a form of world repairing or not? What does identity mean in this context? What are we actually talking about when we say religion or non-religion or something next to religion? Especially when law depends so much on categories and definitions and sub-definitions, you see how much is missing in the actual discussion that goes before the courts and comes out in the judgments. That's a bit where I am with that. Moving forward, I'd like to keep on looking at local instances because I think that's where much more interesting conversations about lived experience of religion, but also of non-religion occur on the ground that aren't suddenly under the baggage of legal language and other things. And moving forward, I think perhaps that if I can say this in the future, I think that legal claims are going to become much more difficult and much more complex than they already have been because there's a legal framework that works for perhaps some of the major religions, not all of them, and just shows the problematic nature of having a definitional approach or a structured approach to these kinds of questions. So looking more, I think, at the ideas of relationship might be helpful in the future in this context.
Well, non-religious, it's a very interesting question. First, I will recall some of the aspects of non-religious I've studied in theology or even in anthropology years ago, before speaking about my actual projects. First, it's special because in theology, they have been speaking about the nuns for years. Not non-religious. I think it's a statistical fact. You know that the Statistic Canada is telling us that some people are answering, I'm non-religious. So now we say, oh, what's this? So it's a new question in this regard. But in theology, for long, they have been questioning atheism, non-believing, indifference. Because engaged religious people are facing indifference around them all the time. And it has been like this for decades. So for them, it's not necessarily people saying, I'm not religious. But they say, listen to these, game of language. A lot of theologians, very well-known, famous theologians in Germany and elsewhere did. They would say, yeah, people say yes to Jesus Christ, but no to the church. And then after they say no to Jesus Christ, no to the church, but yes to God. And then they say, maybe more recently they would say, they say no to God, no to Jesus Christ, no to the church, but yes to the rituals. So it has been going on, this kind of conversation for years and years, and I would say since the 50s, at least, even before in other theological debates. And it's interesting because it's not negative. So regarding the future and what Brian was saying about what the churches are thinking of this, one of the basic narrative of Christianity, and you can find even a stronger narrative in the Jewish tradition, is that at the beginning, they were happy few, just a few ones, in kitchens, in homes, So the narrative at the origin of this Christian religion that became so big and so huge is very small. And there is even a theology and some traditional theologies, or not traditional theologies, but more post-Vatican II theologies, and even before that are saying that being small is better. Being small number is better, it's more authentic. You cannot force people into your church, into your faith, and freedom became more and more important. So for a lot of Christians, in its theological discourse, this new way of being capable to say no to the church is good, because then it's more authentic. So it's a strong trend in theology. Doesn't mean that the institution and the officials are saying the same, but it has been very present in the biblical studies, in the history of Christianity, and in systematic theology, and on and on. Also, I would say that it's a paradox, but because Quebec is very Catholic, it's very Christian, even in the statistics. There's more non-religious in the statistics, but since the 70s we have been discussing about pluralism all the time. New religious movements, atheism in the 60s, and they were saying in the 70s in Quebec, there is more in the province of Quebec, there's more than 1,200 groups now, all kinds of religions, and not only world religions, but very small groups confessing very, new kinds of faiths and beliefs and so on. And then after these waves of migrations and on, and this year 2001 was a key player in our imagination, because after religion as religion became something bad for a lot of people, you know, so it has, I would say that the non-religion has been always there in some ways since the 50s, the 60s, if you consider the, you know, the events, the current events. So my research, there's two questions I think that are really new to address in relation to non-religious. First, chaplaincies. It's true that in institutions, school, hospitals, prisons, it has been mainly about world religions officially, but informally, good chaplains could deal with all sorts of non-beliefs and beliefs. But now I'm trying to do some research in Quebec prisons to see how they deal with this. They're supposed to deal well with this, with religious freedom, with pluralism. Do they do, and how do they do it? And you know, this group of the nuns who really want to keep their distance from rituals or some kinds of readings, reading the Bible or whatever, you know, other sacred text. Do they have something to respond to their needs? So that's, I'm going to look during the next 4 years. Last question. Around radicalization, what is very interesting is that one research was made in Quebec on college students, les cégeps. You know. It was a questionnaire, and one of the results, and I want to discuss with the Sherpa, which is the research group who did the research, one of the results is that in the questionnaire, the students saying that they have no religion had a stronger I would say, they said that it seemed that they would show a certain profile to become more radicalized, more than the religious students. That's interesting. And then you speak with criminologists or psychologists who know about religion. It's not the case of all of them, because religion can be very, very problematic in the discipline of psychology for certain people. But they say that they see religion as something protecting the individuals from all sorts of things. So is it so true? And I think it's a big question for the research on non-religious and the ethical aspects and you know, the changing the world aspect. What in religion is good for individuals? So, and I'm sure that in this non-religious sphere, you can find similar things, but it was a research result, and atheists in Quebec were very unhappy with this result. But it was not deplored, it was not explained. It was a quantitative study. But it's a question, right? Why do a lot of people think that human beings need religion in some ways? It's there in a lot of disciplines. So it's a question that I will maybe not address in my current research on radicalization in the media. It's a 3-year project, but somehow we will try to discuss this more deeply.
And future.
So what about the future of non-religious and religious? Well, you know, I love the Peter's answer, the non-answer. Peter's non-answer, a good social scientist should not predict anything. But I must say that we will certainly have to deal with more diversity in the future, because there is more and more, you know, because of migration, global movements, and so on. But I'm really on the side of thinking about things in saying that, yeah, it is new, but not that new, because as I said this morning, we don't know much about the history of the human race. We don't know much about the non-religious in the past, for many reasons. So in the future, I hope that because of this new question being asked this way about the nuns, that we will get more research on different periods of history showing how religion and non-religions and non-religious could, interact, and were kind of a mixed group. And what do we call non-religious? What do we call religion? It's so in the future, I hope that we will grow. We will have more knowledge on the complexity of the current period, but also on the past of our history.
My research was on the cultural creatives, which is, as I said, a trend in the Western societies. But I focused my research on the spiritual but not religious cultural creatives, and what spirituality means to them and how does it influence their daily lives. And because they're, according to the authors, they're trying to improve society, to find social innovations and new ways to live together. So that was my question. I didn't address the notion of non-religious non-religions, but I discussed the terms of postmodernity, ultramodernity, and these kind of things, just to see in how can we describe the period we live in, and how can we describe this blurry kind of society we are in. And I took the term ultramodernity from the two French sociologists, Jean-Paul Villem and Yves Lambert. And Yves Lambert describes ultramodernity as an axial turn between two big cultural periods, so between modernity and a possible after-modernity. And in this axial turn, we have different groups, different beliefs, different systems that live in kind of that coexist together. And one of them would be the cultural creatives that represent a transmodern way of living. Like it would be, it's not rejecting. It's rejecting some of the modern system, but it also integrates traditional and modern beliefs, traditional and modern ways of organizing, etc. So I, with my spiritual but not religious cultural creatives, who one of the emphasis on ultramodernity and also the cultural creatives, that we had an entry in, well, excuse me, it's all messed up in well, ultramodernity corresponds to the entry of the Anthropocene, which is an era marked by the footprint of human activity and the awareness of that. And so it begins in the 80s with especially the Chernobyl crisis in the 1986. So even if we had this awareness with the post World War II with nuclear like agency, etc., the entry in the Anthropocene is really marking the entry in ultramodernity, which is a radicalization of modernity and the generalization of its own meta-narratives and ideology. So what I did with my cultural creatives, with my respondents, it's I asked them about their values, their worldviews, and one of the things I noticed was that they have a strong anti-hegemonic discourse, and it marks the end of the adherence to modern narrative and to the modern myth. And also they criticize the dollar or money as a new god. They're really skeptical about the continuity of this capitalistic neoliberal system. And they agree that we are in an in-between period where there are two forces fighting each other, the spiritual force and the material force. And they hope for a new emerging society that would be more based on the spiritual principles, but more humanistic. So it's really a mix of things, non-religious things, but more humanistic, more spiritual, or more just like a way of living together that is more peaceful. And they're confident that there's an underground mass of people that is thinking already differently and in a better way. They have like an uppity, realistic view, so they're realistic about society, but they're also optimistic about the future. They're optimistic on the youth that is coming, that is the next generation, and that will bring new innovations, new ideas to live more peacefully. There's also, I took the term maker culture from an Australian sociologist, and I think, so the culture created is already representative of a maker culture, and in French I make the distinction between une culture de l'agir et une culture du faire. So that's really two distinct words, agir and faire, weekend doing. I don't know how to translate it correctly. And it's the characteristics that as I was saying this morning, they're really into localism, and the main action, the main implication is the consumption, and it's called the consommation, contraction between consuming and action. Especially with food, they try to feed themselves locally, organically, with a very short network of people. They try to do as much as possible volunteering. They have many different causes, and it's always between three themes, between well-being with a more psychological axis, also with a social implication, but more like relationships, trying to have a better society according to new social models. And also, of course, the environmental issues like working with animals, plants, flowers, trees, anything. And they try to embody their values as much as possible, just to inspire other peoples and to show the way how to do it. Actually, so it's the role model is very valued in this for these individuals. And the motto for them is the changing oneself to change the world. So they're really trying to work on themselves with personal improvement. They go into psychotherapy a lot, multiple times in their life, and it's a basis for then a future action, a global action. So that's why spirituality was interesting, because spirituality in that sense is a quest of meaning. They're trying to find their places in the world, what motivates them, what's good for the planet, what's good for society. And I could find passion narratives in their career job. And it was, most of them had two jobs. So one just to cover the basic needs of daily life, and the other one was really a passion to, most of them were therapists or really into the well-being domain. And they combined these two jobs just to cover basic needs and also to help others and to have an impact on society. It was the main impact with consumption on society. And about world repairing visions, as we discussed earlier, I'm really interested in the millennials, because I think most of them are born with a language of environmental, that addresses directly environmental issues. They have like all the terms in mind already, like unicity, like ecology, like a lot of things. They're really interested in finding new ethics for themselves, for others, and for nature. So it's like a triangulation that goes together. That go together. The three terms, the three principles, and yeah. So I'm interested in the future, maybe to see how this goes on and how does it develop. And I'm quite confident that this trend will grow further. So we'll see.
So my interest in religion and non-religion is actually somewhat incidental, and it always has been, because really what I'm interested in is solidarity, what makes people care about each other, and how do you convert that care into a willingness and an ability to act. But I have been inspired by the social scientific study of religion, in as much as that it helps us to think about things like beliefs, values, rituals, and the institutions that inspire solidarity. I've actually been particularly interested in what Peter was calling the big thinkers or philosophers and theologians, and also anthropologists, who've observed the connection between sense of transcendence, whatever that means, and that's a much longer discussion, and a willingness to act politically. Oftentimes they actually link that to Christianity, and I'll just put out there that that's something I very much challenge. I don't think they have a monopoly on transcendence. But anyway, I'm very interested in the arguments. So in a way, I kind of have a feeling that if I was doing my research in sort of the 19th century in England, I'd probably be exploring what are the theologies and churches that enable or inhibit a sense of solidarity. But the thing is that I feel like that's not the interesting thing to be doing at present. We should be looking at categories that are growing, if I can call it a category, and for me that is people who are religiously unaffiliated. Again, I don't think that term's perfect. I also sometimes use the word secular, like Lois Lee does, to mean those for whom religion is no more than a secondary concern. In an ideal world, I wouldn't talk about religion at all, I think, except that I've got to find a way of picking people. I was inspired by the notion of cultural creators, but again, you have to do the whole spiritual but not religious thing. So I don't know how we get out of that, or whether that's what I want to do. So, as Peter and Deal both saying, I guess what it means to be religiously unaffiliated depends very much on the time and the place you're looking at and what counts as religion. So currently I'm in Vancouver and I'm working with a group of civic activists who try and create radical democratic renewal by bringing together churches, unions, community groups and academics to ask, what are the things that you share in common that you feel needs to be done with the world, and how are we going to bring that about, basically. And I start with this kind of awkward question of saying religion, secularity is on the rise in the Western world, and in Cascadia or Vancouver in particular, where secularity is defined as people for whom religion is of no more than a secondary concern. Am I talking about you? it's a bit of a clumsy way of doing it, but it seems to get me the kind of people that I'm interested in. I haven't yet worked out how to justify that methodologically. And actually this has been really interesting because there it's ended up involving both those that I expected it to. People I'm particularly interested in are both sort of post-Christians and also people who really haven't ever thought about religion. They're the ones that really interest me. The only time they encounter religion is in an argument they might have had with a religious person 5 or 10 years ago, and they don't consider it key to their identity. But it's also involved Christians, Jews and Muslims who have, for some reason or other, stressed to me that their religion is not their primary concern and therefore they would like to be involved, and I found them very interesting, so I involved them too. It's involved indigenous people, it's involved Chinese Confucians, it's involved South Asians who prioritise Dharma and think that's an important aspect of life. And I hope that by doing that and allowing people to challenge me and say, hey, what's to say I can't be involved in this study, that will help me begin to think, okay, well, what do these terms really mean? Because a lot of these people are taking offence at being put in the boxes that I'm putting them in. And then I start asking questions intended to explore whether or not they do have notions of transcendence and how these are filled with positive content through imaginaries, what I call myths, or like stories of great events and characters that inspire them. And where that content comes from. Is it coming from institutions or traditions or particular individuals? Is it coming from their friends or their parents? Is it coming from politicians? So I ask things like, why do you do what you do? Does what you do say anything about what you believe? Do you have an idea of the world as it should be that you carry around in your head with you? What does that world look like? What are the words that you might associate with it? Are there any great events, whether in the media, history, or in your personal life, that inspire you? Do you have any? And things like that. And I hope that as I begin to talk about what kind of films people like, what kind of books people like, what kind of people inspire them, I can begin to fill out their kind of social imaginary with some content. What I've come to notice that most of these people share in common is a belief in the ability of people to be more than the sum of their parts, and a sense that the actions they partake in within their lifetime will contribute to a better world, whether within their lifetime or in a future that they won't exist in. So, talking about their beliefs, they draw on great characters from history, on upsetting stories from the media, such as the Syrian child that washed up on a beach in Greece in 2017. They act and they enact these beliefs through what I call rituals of sort of variously, I'm not really sure at the moment, total belonging or enchanted belonging, or with somewhat of an nod to Laurie, a kind of deep solidarity. The total belonging one is most interesting to me for a particular reason, and that's capitalism. So we're all aware, I'm sure, of theorists of the separation of spheres and the differentiation of values and political and economic roles. I feel that a number of my participants have been conscientized by the realization that we're now going through a process of de-differentiation. And I don't actually mean in terms of totalizing religious narratives or totalizing ideological narratives, though they do mention them too, but rather the de-differentiation that's brought about by the infiltration of the logic of the market into all spheres of life. So that's why I end up calling a process of challenging this total belonging, because it's a sort of deliberate reference to the Maussian idea of total social facts, the idea that there are kind of ways of living that impinge on religious, legal, political, economic, personal, public ways of life. And the process for doing this is sort of that people seek to radically interrupt what they see as the instrumentalization of social relationships through simple acts like giving different people their time and attention. And again, I thought that was interestingly linked to Julia's point about people exploring personal and social transformation and seeing it as something that has to start with themselves. And similarly, I see it as with my participants, although I'm not supposed to say my participants, that they see their first duty as transforming the way they relate to other individuals on a daily basis, and that huge ideological changes will happen from there. And I also wonder if total belonging, thinking about it in this way, can help us think about categories differently. So I'm avoiding terms like post-secularity for describing these processes, because it seems to apply a reawakening to the role of religion broadly understood. And instead, I think what this de-differentiated activism seems to hold up is, it holds something in common with what, for again, want of a better word, you might call pre-religious spiritual cultures, such as indigenous culture. And I mean pre-religious in the way, say, Timothy Fitzgerald used the term religious. And also then what Marx thought of as the cultures of the future, where spiritual, political and personal realms might be fused. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I haven't really thought this through yet, but I have an inkling that there is a clear connection between this organic distaste with capitalism amongst my quite irreligious liberal middle class people that I'm studying, and reactions with religious Islamic reform in India, and also ideological totalitarianism that's arising elsewhere in the world, in the sense that these liberal people are realizing that if they want to inherit the future, they're going to have a clear set of narratives and practices for doing that. So I'm quite hopeful that, although probably the next 5 or 10 years of politics are going to be quite depressing, there's something coming around the corner.
All right,
Should I stop this?
I think we might as well stop, yeah?
Yeah.